What's up, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So amidst this whole crisis in Ukraine, it seems that no country has been more supportive of regime change than the U.S. But according to U.S. officials, their support of the revolution and interim government has nothing to do with imperialism, resource grabs, or Kiev's new willingness to accept IMF loans. Yes, I'm sure that Obama, Vice President Biden, and Secretary Kerry are all motivated by pure altruism. In fact, take a look at Biden reiterating the West's commitment to the country.
It is not just a foreign policy judgment. It is a personal, it's an emotional commitment as well.
Oh, he's so excited to deliver democracy to the Ukrainian people that he's moved beyond foreign policy interests. How noble. Turns out Joe Biden is so personally invested in the development that he's sacrificing his youngest son, Hunter, to sit on the board of directors of Ukraine's premier oil company, Burisma Holdings. And even though it seems that the story is obviously exposing D.C.'s agenda and establishing an economic partner and resource beneficiary, apparently the State Department isn't worried at all about how this will be perceived.
I'm wondering if there are concerns from this building about the perception about how the Russians and or the Ukrainians would perceive the involvement of a son of the Vice President of the United States, especially given the situation.
No, there are not.
Huh. I guess it turns out that blatant corruption isn't something to be ashamed of anymore. So if you're sick of empires using democracy as a smokescreen to grab resources while throwing self-determination under the bus, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
In theory, the U.S. patent system was created to protect entrepreneurs from having their ideas and original products stolen by competing companies and designers. But over the last couple decades, the patent system in this country has completely fallen apart and led to outrageous intellectual property claims on behalf of multinationals. Take, for instance, Amazon. Last week, the leader in online shopping was granted one of the most absurd patents in recent history. Thanks to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Amazon now owns the rights to taking pictures of people or objects against a white backdrop. Yes, you heard me right. Amazon just patented one of the most common photographic techniques ever by submitting a diagram of specific measurements and lighting designs. So now every time a modeling company or ad agency wants to use a simple white backdrop for their photo shoot, they better be prepared to go head-to-head with Amazon's legal department. But I guess this type of ridiculousness is to be expected from the same company that also patented one-click shopping. Yes, all the way back in 1999, Amazon was granted sole ownership of the concept of clicking one button to complete an online shopping order. This patent is estimated to be worth billions of dollars, and other online retailers such as Apple now actually have to license one-click shopping from Amazon. Of course, for the rest of the startup businesses out there who want to make online shopping as easy as possible for their customers, you better make sure that it takes at least 2 clicks to make a purchase unless you want to be delivered a cease and desist letter from an Amazon drone. But of course, Apple is just as guilty of abusing the system as Amazon. In 2012, Apple was granted exclusive rights to a geometric shape, the rectangle. Well, specifically a rectangle with rounded corners, you know, the shape of pretty much every one of their tablets and smartphones, not to mention their apps. Apple's used this patent to sue Samsung for also creating smartphones and apps with rounded corners, although thankfully the company lost its suit against the Korean electronics giant last year. But speaking of apps, perhaps no patent claim is more baffling than the one granted to game designer King.com. See, King.com is the maker of the wildly popular app Candy Crush. And earlier this year, the company actually applied to trademark the word candy, which unbelievably was approved by the U.S. Patent Office. Yes, companies are now resorting to trying to own everyday words. And the trademark applied not just to online games, but also educational services and clothing. Now, thankfully, the company withdrew their application after fierce backlash from other game designers. So, luckily, if you're a stripper named Candy, you don't have to hide those engraved booty shorts with your name on it. But perhaps no patent is more dangerous to the freedom of speech than the one granted to the pseudo company Personal Audio. See, Personal Audio was given a patent in 2012 for, quote, a system for disseminating media content representing episodes in a serialized sequence. Yes, this ridiculously broad-sounding patent is now being used to go after media companies that create podcasts. Despite the fact that podcasting is one of the most popular forms of media in the world right now, Personal Audio claims that anyone who podcasts is violating their rights. The company has even sued the likes of How Stuff Works and comedian Adam Carolla. And even though the company claims to be a legitimate operation, Personal Audio pretty much makes all of its revenue from patent trolling. This is a technique where fake companies are set up solely to establish as many patents as possible and then go after companies that infringe on their intellectual property. The practice has become so widespread that patent lawsuits have seen an exponential rise in the last decade, due entirely to patent trolling. So yet again, an agency that was established to protect the little guy has become completely corrupted and usurped by monopolized corporate interests. And in the corporatocracy, the only thing that apparently can't be trademarked yet are our souls, at least for now. Charter schools are a relatively new concept in the U.S., but over the last 2 decades, their popularity has grown by leaps and bounds. These schools operate with a mix of private and public funding and were established as a way to test out innovative approaches to education without the burden of strict government regulations. But a new report released earlier this month by the Center for Popular Democracy and Integrity in Education paints a picture of a charter school system beset by fraud, mismanagement, and abuse. According to the report, over $100 million appropriated to the charter system has been squandered in the 15 major cities that the study examined. So where is all the money going, and just how broken is the system? Well, to discuss just that, I'm joined now by Zoe Carpenter, journalist for The Nation, who just wrote an article titled, "Despite Shocking Reports of Fraud at Charter Schools, Lawmakers Miss Opportunity to Increase Oversight." Thank you so much for coming on again, Zoe. So start by outlining some of the most egregious examples of fraud in this new report.
Sure, so there are lots of examples. Some of the most shocking are the ones where charter executives used the taxpayer money for personal gain, buying cars, buying houses, throwing dollars at strippers, going on cruises. And then there are more examples of fraud in terms of increasing the funding for the schools that they get from the federal government. So pretending that students are enrolled who actually aren't enrolled because they get extra funding per student. Or then there are cases of just mismanagement that put students at risk in terms of safety regulations, properly vetting faculty and staff, proper services for special needs students. So the range of abuses is quite broad, but it really is endemic throughout the system. In just 15 states, $100 million is a huge amount of money.
It really is. And last week, the House passed a bill called the Success and Opportunity Through Quality Charter Schools Act, very long name. What was contained in that bill?
So that bill broadly was meant to support and expand the charter school networks across the country. It increased federal funding from $250 million a year to $300 million a year, so that's a significant percentage increase. It streamlined some federal programs for charters, and it encouraged expansion of existing charter networks, even in states that have been more unwelcoming to charters. It did have some provisions that charter critics were supportive of, for example, allowing schools to weight the admissions for special needs students and English language learners to give them an extra leg up in the admissions process.
And as I understand, the bill was quite watered down from its original bill. Its counter component that emerged kind of failed on a lot of sides and a lot of fronts. Why talk about how it failed, and also why did it have such enormous bipartisan support if it didn't actually address everything that needed to be?
Sure. So the missed opportunity was in a series of amendments that was offered by Democratic representatives to increase oversight and transparency and accountability measures that could stop some of this fraud and abuse that we're seeing. Unfortunately, most of those amendments, all except one, I believe, were voted down, and there really wasn't much Democratic support for those amendments, which is troubling for those of us on the left who would like to see accountability here. And yeah, I think the bill had such wide support because charters are broadly popular. There's a lot of money behind them from Wall Street, from Silicon Valley. And from the Democratic side, the president and the education secretary, Arne Duncan, have been big proponents of the charter movement. And so some of the sources that I talked to within the party said that that has made it more difficult for Democrats to speak out and really question whether we should be privatizing our public education system.
Why do you think the Democratic Party has taken such a lead in kind of cementing this notion of privatizing and standardization?
I think that's a really good question. Obviously, there's a close relationship between a certain faction of the Democratic Party and Wall Street and with Silicon Valley, some of the people who are putting money behind the charter movement. And I think there is sincere concern about our public education system, which is warranted. You know, the public education system is in dire straits. That's just an honest fact. But if you look at the reasons for that, it's a clear resources problem. When we have a crazy tax system where schools are getting most of their funding from the local tax base, you have a system where schools in poorer districts are going to have a hard time educating their students. And so it's, I think Democrats, when they're trying to be pro-education, charters are an appealing alternative. But at this point, there isn't really good evidence to suggest that creating two parallel education systems is really going to be the best thing for everyone.
What about the studies that have kind of said that standardization actually, tests higher at charter schools?
Right, so those reports are very mixed because you have to look at the kinds of students that are entering charter schools. And there's a lot of evidence that charter schools have a much lower percentage of special needs students and a lower percentage of English language learners. And that's one good thing about this bill, that it could start to help rebalance that. There's also been anecdotal evidence of charter schools pushing out students who are failing to meet their standards before the testing happens. And so it's really not a very equitable test if you're just looking at test scores.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's the whole problem with standardization in the long run, is that you're just looking at numbers without really looking at the individual basis.
Exactly.
What needs to be done to reform the charter school system, and how can we actually completely eliminate this fraud, widely mismanaged taxpayer dollars here?
Well, accountability and oversight, that's a big thing. And you can advocate for those things without actually engaging in the ideological arguments about charters versus traditional public schools. Any industry, and charters are an industry, they're publicly funded in part, but they're privately managed. Any industry needs some regulation and some oversight, particularly when what's at stake is the education of America's children. And common sense things like having open board meetings, requiring financial disclosures so you can actually see where taxpayer money is going, conflict of interest requirements, and then allocating some of the federal funding that's going to charters to some of those oversight activities so that states actually have the resources to do the public auditing. And then there's another argument once you get into the bigger debate about whether we should have a two-tiered system, and I think that needs to be a debate that's engaged more seriously by the media and by lawmakers about whether we really want to privatize our public education system and have private companies being responsible for that.
It definitely does need to be discussed more. Thank you so much, Zoe Carpenter. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Coming up, I'll talk about a stunning new report that outlines how rampant torture is around the world. Stay tuned, very shocking.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
the media, the candidates, the corporatocracy. Covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the Set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
It's the year 2014, and humanity has evolved pretty fantastically. I mean, just look at what we've done as a collective species over the last 50,000 years, let alone the last 3 decades. So one would only assume that humanity is also evolving ethically and morally at the same rate it is technologically, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, some could argue that it has stagnated at a moral level. See, despite the mantra that every human being is deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, torture is still alive and well in 141 countries around the world, according to Amnesty International. This stark reality exists a whole 66 years after the UN adopted the Declaration of Human Rights against the barbaric practice, which said that, quote, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. The unacceptable notion of torture was further cemented in 1987 when the UN adopted the Convention Against Torture. Basically, every international body and human rights organization in the world has absolutely decreed an all-out ban on torture under any circumstance, including war. But these laws don't seem to hold much water in today's reality. According to Amnesty International's 2014 torture report, torture is not restricted to tyrants and dictators. Governments across the political spectrum and from every continent still collude in this ultimate corruption of humanity, using torture to extract information, force confessions, silence dissent, or simply as cruel punishment. Now, the most common torture methods against detainees today include beating, electric shocks, stress positions, waterboarding, and sensory or sleep deprivation, burning, rape or threat of rape, among many others. Amnesty's report also found that a startling 44% of people around the world are terrified of being tortured by authorities if they're arrested in the borders of their own country. Here in the U.S., that number is 32%, which isn't too surprising given this nation's trigger-happy militarized police force that regularly brutalizes its people. Or the fact that America has 25% of the world's prisoners, many of which spend decades in solitary confinement, which has also been defined as torture by the UN. Or how about the fact that the Bush administration employed a top-down torture program that conducted some of the most inhumane methods on that list, including sexual humiliation and waterboarding at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And given that none of the torture perpetrators in the U.S. were ever held accountable and are still justifying their horrendous crimes, is it any wonder that the rest of the world considers torture okay and continues to employ the tactic? In fact, the former UN Special Rapporteur on torture told Al Jazeera that the U.S., quote, that many countries have followed the U.S.'s lead and cited national security interests as a rationale to justify the use of any means necessary to extract information from suspected terror suspects. But the U.S. isn't just paving the way for the codification of torture. It also gives some of the most brutal regimes hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid every year. As a matter of fact, the top 10 recipients of aid sponsored by U.S. tax dollars are all regimes that regularly torture their citizens, which stands in direct violation of a U.S. law called the Foreign Assistance Act. But like I said, laws are outweighed by the empire's desire to host puppet regimes, black sites, and drone bases. According to the Congressional Research Service for 2014, the U.S. gives Uganda $456 million in aid. Then there's Tanzania, which will get a hefty $553 million. And the same goes for Kenya, which is set to receive a whopping $564 million in aid this year. Then there's Iraq, which has been under brutal military assault from the West for decades. It will get $573 million. Jordan is set to get $671 million in aid, a country where you can't even criticize the king. But perhaps no other nation rivals Nigeria in its horrendous human rights abuses, which is going to get a hefty check of $693 million this year. In addition to the widespread use of torture, nearly 1,000 people died in military custody in just the first 6 months of 2013. Next up, Pakistan, set to get $1.2 billion in aid, but the country practices extrajudicial killings and disappears its citizens regularly. Moving on to Egypt, a country that still receives $1.6 billion in aid from the U.S., despite widespread sentencing of thousands of people at a time to death for simply being members of the Muslim Brotherhood. According to Daily News Egypt, at least 1,300 protesters have been outright massacred since the coup. Afghanistan is next, currently under U.S. occupation, sees a flow of $2.2 billion in annual aid. And sitting high at number 1 is the U.S.'s biggest ally in the Middle East, Israel. See, Israel gets a cool $3.1 billion from this government. And despite it touting itself as the strongest democracy in the region, it's an apartheid state that regularly tortures Palestinians, including children. A recent report by the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel described how detained children suspected of minor crimes have been sexually assaulted and kept in outdoor cages during winter. So maybe instead of squabbling about unemployment benefits and food stamps eating into your paycheck, we should be demanding that the flow of aid is cut off until these countries can abide by basic human rights, dignity, and international law. And the first country that needs to step up to the plate to do just that is this one. So last Friday, Obama headed to Walmart, of all places, to talk about private sector energy efficiency. And what better green company to tout than Walmart, a corporation whose carbon emissions have increased by 14% over the last 8 years, according to a 2013 report by Local Self-Reliance. Of course, based on the company's environmental sustainability campaign, you would think this retail giant was a leader in renewable energy. But of course, it's not just Walmart that has launched a PR campaign to brand themselves as green or efficient. And misleading the public in such a way has outraged environmentalists who have coined this type of corporate scheming as something called greenwashing. So join me now to break down some infamous cases of corporate greenwashing from BP to NASCAR. I'm joined by activist and comedian Lee Camp, host of the Moment of Clarity web series. What is up, dude?
How you doing?
What's going on, man? So let's start with General Electric's Echo Imagination campaign. Let's look at this ridiculous example of greenwashing. First, we have a kid who's trying to catch air in a jar with their commercials. I don't know if we have that queued up, but it's just hilarious. I mean, why is this so ridiculous, Lee?
Oh, yeah, it's an amazing commercial. It's a kid who gets air in a jar. Do we have it?
Yes,
Oh,
yay.
yes. Awesome. But it's, you know, eco-imagination. They created a word for this. It's very important. They created a word. Really, it should be called eco-monopolize because they're, you know, they'll put all this money into drilling and fracking and everything. And meanwhile, they're trying to stop wind power. So they're trying to stop the other things that could be out there everywhere because they can't monopolize those as easily. So they, you know, they'll put all this money into deep-sea drilling, and they won't put a tip of a turd into solar power or wind because they want to hang on to it. It's got to be their thing.
Right, they actually attempted to monopolize the wind industry. They're hurting wind turbine sales, making it real hard for other people to actually develop wind energy. But, you know, as long as you can just catch wind in a jar, Lee, you can keep those machines going and going and going.
That commercial means as much as a kitten playing with an Easter egg, all right? They could have just shown that, and you would have been like, look, it's green, see?
So, of course, we'd be remiss by not talking about ExxonMobil, which was named, get this, the greenest company of the year from Forbes. Of course, Forbes, why should we be surprised, in 2009. Absurdity.
You're saying that's not accurate? Greenest company of the year? Really? You couldn't find anything else, Forbes? Like, I don't know, Amber's Hemp Palace wasn't slightly greener than Exxon? But no, I want to read this quote from Forbes. They said, the engineering solution to the matter of carbon in the atmosphere causing global warming, drill for natural gas, which methane releases 40 to 50% less carbon dioxide than coal and a quarter less than petroleum. So they're saying replacing all coal would cut CO2 emissions by 1 billion tons a year. They leave out something. Methane traps 86 times as much heat as carbon dioxide. So I mean, that's like saying, well, you've got a rash on your hand, chop off the hand. There, solve the problem.
Great solution, Exxon.
Well done,
amazing.
Exxon.
And you have BP kind of trying to greenwash themselves with this campaign beyond petroleum. No, we don't care about what our entire corporation is based on, which is petroleum, British petroleum. We're going to go beyond petroleum. Let's move us beyond.
I think you misunderstand. They want to go beyond petroleum by using it all up. That's how they'll get there, all right? They're trying to go beyond petroleum. Once I ordered 800 boxes of Girl Scout cookies, and I had to get beyond Girl Scout cookies by eating them all.
Once they leak all the oil, I guess, once they dump all the oil on the entire planet, then they have to go beyond it, right?
And then you also have to remember, with things like the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, they're trying to be green by covering it up. So it's green for you and me. Right. We don't see the dolphin carcasses. So they're doing a lot of work. They're working hard to cover up. In the middle of the night, they'd like take away dolphin carcasses so that we didn't see them. And, you know, that's a caring move.
I remember Greg Pallas telling me that BP had invested, I think, given an absurd amount of money to fund these scientists who were saying that there was just algae in the Gulf that would eat all the oil. We don't have to worry about cleaning up the oil.
And Kevin Costner's magic oil machine. You remember that?
Exactly.
That gambit they had going when Greg Pallas did the numbers, and, you know, Kevin Costner's machine would have cleaned up about this much oil if you let it run for 6 weeks or something.
Let's just trust beyond petroleum. It sounds like they're doing a really good job. Of course, Exxon's also funding enormous anti-climate change studies. Really absurd there when you look into that. Dow Chemical is another one. Human Element campaign. Of course, we're talking about an insanely egregious chemical company that's responsible for the Bhopal disaster, leaving nearly 3,000 people dead. Just disgusting. This is a complete sham, and the the advertisements are just insulting.
The human element?
Yeah.
Although I actually give it the most accurate one, because they're viewing humans as an element. And what do you do with elements? You burn some of them, you combine them with other elements, you see what happens. We're a giant science experiment, Abby. So they're actually being quite honest. It's the human element, we're going to see what happens.
That is actually really funny. I don't know if we have any examples of that, but it shows like kids' faces with like the, HU on it. And of course, the class action lawsuit in Midland, Michigan ruled Dow contaminated their properties with dioxin, which resulted in the impairment of the immune system, nervous system, androgen system, reproductive functions, according to the World Health Organization. So I don't really know if they think of humans that...
I don't think elements can sue them, so that's why they believe humans can't sue them. So they're, you're an element. Leave us alone.
They're just completely above accountability there. But greenwashing also happens with sports as well. NASCAR, this is absolutely hysterical. Featured Al Gore as its keynote speaker. Amazing.
At the Green Summit.
I mean, it's basically just a greenwashing summit telling people how to label their brands better. NASCAR said that they were going to have a tree planting ceremony for every circle the cars went around, I guess.
Well, so first of all, the idea of just bringing in Al Gore, like Al Gore is just this mascot that we just ship in. Who knows what he said at the thing? Maybe it was good, maybe it was bad, doesn't matter. We just put his face out there. Look at his bulbous head. We must be doing good things. Al Gore's here. He's like one of those car wash balloon guys. You just go like this up front. And you're like, oh, it's green.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lee Camp. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Abby.
That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again. In the development that he's sacrificing his youngest son, Hunter, to sit on the board of directors of Ukraine's premier oil company, Burisma Holdings. And even though it seems that the story is obviously exposing DC's agenda and establishing an economic partner and resource beneficiary, apparently the State Department isn't worried at all about how this will be perceived.
I'm wondering if there are concerns from this building about the perception about how the Russians and/or the Ukrainians would perceive the involvement of a son of the Vice President of the United States, especially given the situation.
No, there are not.
I guess it turns out that blatant corruption isn't something to be ashamed of anymore. So if you're sick of empires using democracy as a smokescreen to grab resources while throwing self-determination under the bus, then join me and let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
once again, to put something on the air that's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These ones are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
In theory, the U.S. patent system was created to protect entrepreneurs from having their ideas and original products stolen by competing companies and designers. But over the last couple decades, the patent system in this country has completely fallen apart and led to outrageous intellectual property claims on behalf of retailers such as Apple now actually have to license one-click shopping from Amazon. Of course, for the rest of the startup businesses out there who want to make online shopping as easy as possible for their customers, you better make sure that it takes at least 2 clicks to make a purchase unless you want to be delivered a cease and desist letter from an Amazon drone. But of course, Apple is just as guilty of abusing the system as Amazon. In 2012, Apple was granted exclusive rights to a geometric shape, the rectangle. Well, specifically a rectangle with rounded corners, you know, the shape of pretty much every one of their tablets and smartphones, not to mention their apps. Apple's used this patent to sue Samsung for also creating smartphones and apps with rounded corners, although thankfully the company lost its suit against the Korean electronics giant last year. But speaking of apps, perhaps no patent claim is more baffling than the one granted to game designer King.com. See, King.com is the maker of the wildly popular app Candy Crush. What's up, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So amidst this whole crisis in Ukraine, it seems that no country has been more supportive of regime change than the U.S. But according to U.S. officials, their support of the revolution and interim government has nothing to do with imperialism, resource grabs, or Kiev's new willingness to accept IMF loans. Yes, I'm sure that Obama, Vice President Biden, and Secretary Kerry are all motivated by pure altruism. In fact, take a look at Biden reiterating the West's commitment to the country.
It is not just a foreign policy judgment. It is a personal, it's an emotional commitment as well.
Oh, he's so excited to deliver democracy to the Ukrainian people that he's moved beyond foreign policy interests. How noble. Turns out Joe Biden is so personally invested in multinationals. Take, for instance, Amazon. Last week, the leader in online shopping was granted one of the most absurd patents in recent history. Thanks to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Amazon now owns the rights to taking pictures of people or objects against a white backdrop. Yes, you heard me right. Amazon just patented one of the most common photographic techniques ever by submitting a diagram of specific measurements and lighting designs. So now every time a modeling company or ad agency wants to use a simple white backdrop for their photo shoot, they better be prepared to go head-to-head with Amazon's legal department. But I guess this type of ridiculousness is to be expected from the same company that also patented one-click shopping. Yes, all the way back in 1999, Amazon was granted sole ownership of the concept of clicking one button to complete an online shopping order. This patent is estimated to be worth billions of dollars, and other online